welcome back to another episode of World Wildlife Journeys. And today I have in the studio with me, or rather halfway around the world, a very dear friend of mine, Dr. Zeke Davidson, who is a wildlife biologist. And he's going to talk to us a little bit today about spatial conservation and the importance of preserving habitats, especially where it pertains to large carnivores. In particular, his specialty is lions. So Zeke, from down under, welcome to the show.
Russell, thank you very much. It's very good to see you again after such a long break. And what you're saying about spatial conservation is so close to my heart at the moment, having worked on large carnivores, but also other large mammals. Lions in particular are such a good example of the space that wildlife needs to persist in today's world. And the fact that we are now forcing them into smaller and smaller places, and they are having to thread the needle between these protected areas to try and find enough room to persist, I think is something we need to pay a lot of attention to as the human species.
Talk to us a little bit about that dispersal process, because it's something that a lot of people don't appreciate, that the lions go through this period where as young males, they're not tolerated by the dominant male, and they basically get booted out. And this is how the genes get spread between different gene pools. Is that right?
Yeah, that sums it up. Male lions have to leave their natal prides at some point, or battle the seniors, to get their place. And so they go walkabout, as they would say in Australia, or if you're familiar with the East African concept of moranship, where a young man and his brothers have to live off the land for 15 good years, as they say.
Yeah.
You live off the land. That's what these lions are doing, and they go walkabout looking for a territory that they can occupy, and they basically get bounced around until they find a spot that works for them.
And frequently, this means that they actually end up utilizing the areas around the park that are outside the park. So they're not in protected areas during this period of their life. Is that right?
Particularly lions that come from areas that are essentially too small to contain the size of area that a lion needs to live in. And even in big parks, you get very strong what's called edge effects. If a lion's living near the boundary of the park, he's not going to be able to penetrate that park because there will be other lions there in the safe place. So he gets reflected out of the park, and then he spends his time walking, sometimes vast distances. We recorded one in Zimbabwe years ago that left Wangi National Park and walked most of the way to Bulawayo, and then came back halfway to the park and turned south and went into Botswana, and then came back north into the bottom of Wangi National Park, and eventually landed up settling, within tens of kilometers of his natal pride, but had walked about 1,000 kilometers in between over a period of 3 or 4 years. So he was bumbering, as they say,
Yeah. Now, your research also showed that a lot of those pride males in Wangi were the same thing, but that they were coming from central Kalahari in Botswana. Is that right?
That's right. There was what was identified at the time as a bit of a vacuum effect in the national park because of some edge effects that were happening around Wangi.
Sorry, by edge effects, you mean trophy hunting?
That was a distinct.
Was creating a sink in that area, and those other males were moving in. On this show, we just tell it like it is. We don't use polite words. So there's hunting around the edges of Wangi National Park, and that removed those males on a fairly regular basis. The most famous incident being Cecil. And that had the effect of pulling those lions out of central Kalahari, right?
They were refilling the park from the south, but it's lions are conflict animals. They're not only hunted, but they get into trouble with anyone who's trying to exist in that same environment, with livestock and that. So we lost a lot of lions to poisoning events and events and that sort of thing as well. So it went through a stage in that area, and certainly this is happening in many places in Africa today, where lions are persecuted just because of their effects. And you've got to understand, as a local living amongst a population of large carnivores, you've got your work cut out for you. It's a game of survival, and so you can't stand in judgment. You have to find ways to work within that paradigm. And the cats certainly do that. So it's very interesting to notice how a lion can live with an absolute scrap of cover. It can conceal itself.
Yeah.
It can hide in sight just about. I've seen that happen. And as long as there is something for a cat to get into, they will be within meters of a herd of cattle, or within meters of a local homestead or manyatta, all day long. And then at night they will come out and move on. And so that's how they thread the needle. They stay in these little bits of cover. I can tell you a story of a male that was moved from central Laikipia, actually northern Laikipia, on the boundary with Isiolo province in central Kenya. It was moved into Tsavo National Park, some several hundred kilometers to the south. And they thought that would be far enough to get this animal away from the cattle raiding it was doing.
Okay.
And it hung around in Tsavo for a while, finding its feet and bearings, but then it turned north and cut a straight line for where it had been, and would have made it if the city of Nairobi hadn't gotten in the way, And it took a left and landed up in the Rift Valley, living in a place called Shompoli, and I think it's still there. But the tenaciousness of that animal crossing a densely human-populated landscapes, it was being tracked by a very high-tech collar. It had a collar on.
Yeah.
And it was being checked on by both researchers and the National Parks Authority, Kenya Wildlife Service. And they were finding it, in the middle of peri-urban places. They couldn't see it, but they knew it was there. The signal was there, and at night it moved on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's a
that's
bit
how
like
they do it.
It's a bit like, I don't know if you've seen those videos of those leopards in Mumbai, but they
Yes.
come into Mumbai and hunt the dogs. And I mean,
Yeah.
they're not, that's not peri-urban. I mean, that's like, you see these leopards running down the street in the middle of the night past the Gucci store on their way to go and find someone's dog. So I mean, leopards are extremely well adapted to do that. But I mean, it's fascinating that your researchers turn up that lions are just about as good.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nairobi, you won't be surprised to go past a chalkboard in a suburb on the side of the road saying "Lion sighted at 6 a.m. this morning. Keep your children and pets indoors." There's a national park in the middle of the city of Nairobi. And it has large carnivores in it. And they come out, they live in the suburbs, they live off the pets and the stock, and they make the odd foray back into the park. But it's a signal that there's just not enough room in that park for the animals that are there at the moment. And this is how they adapt, so space being the issue, not enough of it for them to persist in. And there is a gathering momentum, I think, both in research and in conservation, where people are thinking more about how to leave space in their worlds for wildlife. There's a fantastic movement called the Half Earth movement.
Yeah.
And its founder, Edward Owen Wilson, is a phenomenal scientist, and a father of much of our conservation research, really, and did his seminal work on ants. But his philosophy and the book he's recently written on the Half Earth idea is not that we have to clear half the planet for wildlife, but that we have to make space in our world that we're living in. 50% of our space around us needs to be available for wildlife to live in. And if we consider what happens at the moment with insects, the latest crash being documented is our insect population.
Yeah.
And we're in a lot with our insects,
I mean, so it's an interesting concept, because, what he's saying is not that we have to create massive national parks. Part of this is also just tolerating the wildlife that is in our space. So if a lion is crossing from A to B and looking for somewhere to live, it's saying, okay, well, if it kills some cattle along the way, what we need to do is have a mechanism to compensate those people for their loss of livestock, so that people are more amenable to having that wildlife on their doorstep. Because at the end of the day, it is about space, but it's also about conflict. When you understand that the people of Africa, they don't have banks, they don't keep money in banks. Your herd of cattle is your livelihood. That is your life savings. So, when for people to say, oh, well, so if the lion kills a cow, just go get another cow. But, if the lion was breaking into your 401k and stealing, 1/10 of your life savings, you'd probably feel a bit differently about those lions.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's fraught with immensely complex issues, especially around compensation. And I think that our expectation as humans to be given compensation when something like that goes wrong isn't necessarily right. I think what I've seen work just as effectively, and particularly in this scenario where a family might lose, a good deal of their stock, is simple conciliation and understanding, and being present and being empathic.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we have to realize that these ecosystems and these wild spaces are giving us the ability to host our livestock. They're giving us environments in which we can prosper and be successful. And when we lose that wildlife, when we lose those functional ecosystems, not even the cattle survive, and so the compensation is really the opportunity to be there. And unfortunately, it's really hard, a really bitter pill to swallow when you have lost your livestock. I don't know really how to get that message across.
How to square that circle. Look, it's
no,
what I find myself repeating in almost every single video with every single expert I interview is these are complicated issues. There's no simple solutions. There's very, very smart people working very hard to try and work it out, but it is kind of the irresistible force meets the immovable object. These are really, really tough issues to solve.
They really are.
Now, you and I were talking before we turned the video on about a case study which has always fascinated me, which is this notion of the fact that lions. I think there's a preconceived idea that if animals are endangered, that it's because they're like the panda bear, that they have some kind of inherent problem with breeding. That is very much not the case with lions, right?
No, lions you give lions the right conditions, enough prey, enough space to persist and have their societies functioning normally, and they breed like rabbits. And we showed this. It's been shown in a number of ecosystems, but my personal experience was Wangi National Park, where the numbers had really declined to a very small number. In a nearly 15,000 square kilometer park, there were about 250 lions, and over 4 years of not hunting them and working with communities, we more than doubled that population. They bounced back. Once the young males had come through and established territories, and there was a year of fighting, followed by a year of mating, followed by a year of cubs, and those cubs were raised, and that sort of story of Cecil was woven into all of that and highlighted everything that was going on. But lions and most wildlife, given time and tide, will recover, will do really well, but our problem is that we don't leave them alone. You don't leave them to do what they do naturally.
And probably the best example of this is what we were talking about with the Savi Valley Conservancy, which is a case that you and I know well. It's an area in Zimbabwe where a group of cattle ranchers got together after a rather severe drought where they'd lost most of their livestock. And they basically took down all the internal fencing and created effectively what was a national park. I think it's about 1,400 square kilometers of land. They fenced the periphery and then stocked it with wildlife. But at that time, they were paying hard currency for every animal they put in there. So they didn't stock with lions because they didn't want them. And you then went down and did a survey a couple of years later. So tell us what you found.
Well, we found lions. we found a healthy population of lions. And of course, they knew they were there. It wasn't a surprise. And the question was, how many lions are here and can we withstand it? And I think that's a very interesting question. I've worked on conservancies in East Africa, and I've worked on conservancies in Zimbabwe, and I've worked on different landscapes where lions persist. And I've never found a population of lions that eats its resources down to the bone and has nothing left to eat. So I kind of have the opinion that if you leave them alone again, they're pretty good at managing their resources by hook or by crook. The nature sorts it out. When there's less food, the lions don't reproduce as much. The populations shrink, and this is a model we see repeated in many species. They are resource limited, so they just produce fewer animals. They senesce or they die perhaps of starvation, and that may be cruel, but in our opinions. But that's how nature works, And so there we were in Savi Valley with all these very expensive animals on the ground and a very healthy population of lions. And what did they discover? That the ecosystem was working very well, and that ecotourism was thriving because they had a wonderful offering of everything that should be in the bush. And the key thing that you said there was that, apart from putting the animals back, they took down the internal fences. So what did they do? They made space.
Yeah.
They stopped, and they didn't just make space for lions, obviously. They made space for functional ecosystems, and that's the key. And so, even at the level of your garden, around your home, whether you're living with a balcony or you're living with an acre or more, that mosquito that's biting you at night and annoying you, probably, you shouldn't slap it, which is the knee-jerk reaction. You realize that that's food for a bird, or that's food for a frog, and that's part of the ecosystem, and put on some dope and stop it biting you if you must. But it works at every single level, leaving space for these things to persist.
Yeah, what a wonderful concept. So tell us, in all of your years of research, what is probably one of the most remarkable things that you've seen, or incidents, or funny things that have happened to you, or what stands out in the time that you've spent in the wilderness, Zeke?
Russell, so many things, anecdotes, flood the mind when you ask a question like that. And which one is the one that stands out? Well, the one that stands out is the experience of nature. Wangi National Park was such an education. I'd come out of a short period of working in advertising and trying to make a living and make money and just, get on with life. And to be honest, I'd gotten a bit lost there. And so I wound up in Wangi working as a research assistant. And just the privilege of being in the bush. And that's what Wangi sold as its safari experience. It didn't try and sell the big five, even though they were there, It didn't promise you a lion sighting or an elephant sighting or even a buffalo sighting. It just said, come and be in the bush. And what I realized, and I think what I took away from all of that, is you spend time in the bush and you will see everything. You will experience everything. But more importantly, you will come away with the serenity and the headspace to live a considered life, where you can actually have space in how you live and how you carry on for 50% for nature at least, because it does make it.
Yeah, this is something that I struggle to understand to people, or to explain to people when I'm talking to them, is what is the element of wilderness, and I have a very simple measure for it now. It's anywhere that you don't get a cell phone signal. And surprisingly, even in Africa, there are very few places you can get to where there just is no cell phone network. But that has become the very simple yardstick for me, is if I don't have a cell phone signal, then I know, the place that you are is truly in the wilderness. When I started doing safaris, you used to have to take an HF radio with you if you wanted to stay in touch with people, which we didn't use to, because the batteries were too heavy and they never worked anyway. So you just jump in your canoe and paddle off down the river, and 6 days later you'd either arrive at your destination or not, and then if you weren't there, they'd send out someone to look for you. But it was that was the way it was. And boy, life has changed significantly. But I think the more we get connected, through the internet and that sort of thing, the wilderness begins to become even more important, because, like you said, it is the only antidote we will ever know or need from the travails of modern life.
No, absolutely. And, I guess my career and the way I describe being a conservation biologist, a zoologist that became a conservation biologist, is my business is about describing the obvious. And I have to spend a lot of time staring at the ground, essentially, counting blades of grass or animals in the bush. I spend my whole life, and so do all my colleagues, trying to understand simple things that nature reveals to you if you look at it for long enough. And the way we do that as biologists is, we number up everything and we create great databases, and then we split them up with statistics and we say, does this relate to that? And at some point we go, oh yeah, the simple is true. Look, these two things connect, whatever they may be. Yeah. And the people who've lived on all their lives will say, well, I told you that on day one. I could have told you that now. But and our argument is no, but we haven't got the stats. We haven't got the proof, you know.
Yeah.
But all we do is describing the obvious, you know.
Yeah, until it's empirically measured and metered, then you can't say that it's true. And I think that's always been the fascinating, or the conversations that we've had over the years. It's always been, and you with any guides, because you know, guides do spend a lot of time observing and wondering about stuff. We don't necessarily have the scientific background to figure it out. But I mean, 90% of our conversations have started with me coming to you and saying, hey, Zeke, I had this thought when I was on a game drive the other day. What do you think about this theory? And most of them you've been very polite about. But it's
I don't have nearly any of the answers, but what I do enjoy is finding them, you know, because you know, these natural systems are so important, and if nature had a voice and a conscience that it could speak with, it would be saying, I've been waiting for you for a long time to understand that very simple thing, you know, now use it. You know,
Zeke, you know what, that sounds like the perfect note to end on. I know that you've got other engagements that you've got to get to, but thank you so much, my friend, for taking the time. It's been incredibly good to catch up with you, and I wish you all the luck in your future endeavors down under.
Russell, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. Keep well.
Thanks, my friend. Everybody, that's it for this week. I hope that you've enjoyed our presentation, and for more, sign in next week. And until then, I hope that you all stay safe and healthy. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.